Hello everyone and welcome to today's event. Thank you all so much for joining for this evening for our event Food for Thought. So this evening we're going to be talking about the health impacts of meat consumption, and this event is part of our events programme for our Meet the Future exhibition, which runs until the 8th of May 2022. So you can find out more about the exhibition and the other events that we're running on our website, so do please take a look. And we've been privileged through the exhibition to work with the Livestock Environment and People Research Group, which is co-chaired by Susan Jebb and Charles Godfrey. And so we're delighted to have Susan with us today to chair this event. So I'm going to hand over to Susan now, who's going to introduce the event and the rest of our panellists today. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, and welcome to everybody who's joining us from home this evening. We hope that you will enjoy listening to this sort of conversation. The four of us often find ourselves chatting over coffee or in the sort of fringes of meetings, and we thought it would be rather fun to have that conversation in public and just to bring to the surface some of the issues that we've been debating in this area. The LEAP project's been an extraordinary interdisciplinary project, and we've got colleagues in physics and geography and right round the university. But today we've brought together some of the people who are really working on health. We know that meat production has very significant impacts on the environment, but today we want to talk about what we know about the effects of livestock, meat and dairy, on health, and think about its effects, both good and bad. We know that most of what we know comes from large-scale epidemiology, and in Oxford we're incredibly fortunate to have access to some of the world's greatest cohorts with really detailed information on diet and health. We're also super fortunate to have fantastic teams of epidemiologists, and Tim Key is one of them, and Tim's Professor of Epidemiology with a particular interest in cancer. But also has worked across a range of health issues with an interest in meat. Tim, do you want to just tell us maybe a little bit about the kind of work you do before we sort of zoom in and ask you to tell us a bit about some of your findings in the LEAP project?
Yes, thanks. I thought it would be useful first to just remind people where we get the information. How do we know anything about how diet affects long-term health? And as Susan mentioned, most of the data we have comes from long-term studies, often called prospective studies, where you recruit tens or preferably hundreds of thousands of people who are in good health, and you measure their diet as accurately as you can, possibly take blood samples, and then you follow them for maybe 10 or 20 or 30 years, and then you see what happens to them. And you can follow them through things like cancer registries and causes of death. And what happens is, you take people who eat a lot of meat when they join the study, preferably you get some repeat measurements during the follow-up, and then you look to see whether the people who eat a lot of meat get more or less of various diseases than those people who eat little meat. So it sounds quite simple, it's very slow and expensive. We've got some useful information from these studies, but it does have limitations. The main one that people do need to understand is that there's always a problem of what's called confounding by other factors. So you could imagine someone who eats lots of meat. Maybe they also smoke a lot and go to the pub every night and drink a lot of beer. And those factors, smoking and alcohol, have big effects on lots of things to do with health. And obesity is another really important factor. So, a lot of the work of epidemiologists is trying to sort this out and trying to remove the impact of sort of nuisance factors like smoking, alcohol, obesity, to try and tease out what is the actual impact of the dietary factor we're interested in this case, meat. So I just want people listening to understand that there's still a lot of uncertainties, and the things we're concluding, there's an element of we're not quite sure about some things yet. So, it's difficult, but some things are emerging.
I mean, Tim, you mentioned lots of factors other than diet, which sort of confuse the picture. Yeah. But presumably, even if you're trying to look at meat, you're also having to think about all of the other things that people eat.
Well, that's right. Yeah, I gave the examples of non-dietary factors like smoking, but you're absolutely right. You've also got to worry about the rest of the diet. So if the people who eat a lot of meat also eat a lot of chips and chocolate, that might conceivably be affecting their health more than the meat. So it's even worse than I said. Actually, it's really hard to sort out.
But that said, we have learned something from all of this. It's a good job we've got clever statisticians that have helped to unpick this. So tell us a little bit about the sort of headline findings of what can we say, even if we can't precisely quantify the effect size, in general, what do we think is going on with the relationship between meat and health?
If I could just mention before that, I think it's useful to say, well, what would you expect? And it's interesting when you talk to people or look back in history, there's varying concepts of meat as a food. I think in the past, and probably in many populations, people think this is a really important food that's maybe essential, definitely good for you, and it would have good effects on health. But more recently, with research uncovering possible adverse effects, I think in some, some areas of the population here and elsewhere, meat's now got a bad name, and people sort of think, oh, meat, that's bad for you. And neither is strictly true. If you look at what meat is comprised of, it's obviously potentially a really nutritious food, high in protein, other things like iron and vitamin B12. The reason it might be bad, really, the only clear thing that where meat itself might have an adverse effect is because it's often rich in saturated fat, which is well known to raise cholesterol and therefore risk of cardiovascular disease. But I think that is the only fact about meat that is, you would really think there would be an adverse effect if you ate really large amounts. The sort of related factor, which is not intrinsic to meat, is salt, where a lot of processed meats most processed meats contain quite a lot of salt, and salt raises blood pressure, therefore, again, risk of cardiovascular disease. But beyond that, there's not much reason to think meat would be bad.
And there's quite a lot of salt in quite a lot of other foods as well.
Well, that's right. In fact, if you look at the sort of surveys in this country for where salt comes from, about I think 21% comes from meat, but more than that comes from cereals like bread and other baked goods. It's all been added in manufacture or processing. So, but coming back to your question.
Yeah, so what you're saying to us in a way is actually it's hard to know which way this is.
Well, I think those are the two. I think saturated fat and salt would be bad if you ate large amounts of them, and meat is one source, but not the only source. And on the other side, there are good things about meat, potentially like iron and vitamin B12. And if you don't eat meat, you have to make sure the diet provides those from some other source. So coming back to the question about the top things about health, I think the first one to mention has to be colorectal cancer, because for this disease, the World Health Organization has made a statement that processed meat is carcinogenic to humans, and that's based on the evidence they reviewed for colorectal cancer. So, and I think most people agree with that, but it's the only sort of statement we have from a world authoritative body about a bad effect of meat, and it's specifically for processed meat. The reason for that is actually not yet understood. It's, if we accept it's true, it's probably to do with some of the chemicals that are added or formed during the processing, particularly things called N-nitroso compounds that are known to cause cancer in animal models. They also evaluated red meat that has not been processed, and they said that probably caused colorectal cancer. So anyway, colorectal cancer, that is what's the state of the sort of agreement is now. The size of the increase in risk is not that big. It's, a sort of maybe 10 to 15% increase in risk if you ate, 50 or more grams extra of something like bacon and sausages. So, which if you compare it with other risk factors for cancer like smoking, alcohol and obesity, it's a bit smaller.
So it's a clear risk, but it's
Yeah.
in absolute terms, it's a relatively modest risk.
Well,
alongside
I've actually
some of
got
the
an
other
estimate for
modifier risk
that.
factors.
Look this up.
Well,
Yeah.
Tell us a bit
Well,
more.
it's estimated that 5,000 cases of colorectal cancer a year in the United Kingdom could be explained by the high consumption of processed meat. So that sounds like quite a lot, 5,000 people. That's only 1.5% of all cancers. So it's a small proportion of cancers,
Still 5,000
but it's
people.
still a lot
Yeah.
of people.
Yeah.
So it is important. But
So I guess it's important to
yeah.
recognise that is a modifiable risk
Yeah.
factor. It's something we can do something about, but
Yeah.
it may not be the biggest one, but it is still important.
yeah.
But Tim, you've been working, your interests have slipped from from cancer into cardiovascular disease in meat. So tell us what we've learned about that.
Yeah, well, our group, funded by the LEAP project, published a paper this year where they did systematically reviewed all published literature in the world on meat and ischemic heart disease, and put it together statistically to get a sort of an overall estimate. And that showed a highly statistically significant but modest-sized higher risk for people eating more red and processed meat. So it was around 10% higher risk. And probably that would be roughly what you'd expect due to the higher intake of saturated fat and salt in the processed meat.
So you said red and processed meat there, so we're talking about beef, lamb, pork.
Yeah.
What about poultry? I mean, can you what about poultry?
Well, most of the research that's been done on poultry has found no association, no bad association, no good association. It's fairly null, although not as much research has been done yet on poultry as on the other. You know, there's been a bit of a focus on red and processed meat as the thing to be working on. So less is known about poultry, but not much reason to think that it has the same effect. But it's, you know, it's lower in saturated fat.
And I guess part of the problem is that we don't fully understand the mechanisms. And if we understood better what it was about red and processed meat that seemed to be causing the risk, maybe we'd be able to understand what it is, why poultry is different.
Yeah, but saturated fat could be part of that story because poultry is lower in saturated fat than most types of red meat.
Good, but just before I draw the others in, so at the beginning you said, look, there are all these great things in meat as well. So does eating meat protect our health in any way at all? Are there some things we're less at risk of?
Yeah, well, we looked at this recently in a large study called UK Biobank, and the only disease where meat really looked definitely protective was anemia, which, you know, probably wouldn't surprise anyone because it's a well-known source of well-absorbed iron. So I think that's true. Apart from that, I've thought about this quite hard before this evening, and the only other evidence really at the moment is for one type of stroke called hemorrhagic stroke, where you get a bleed in the brain. And we've found that vegetarians who don't eat any meat, while they have a lower risk of ischemic heart disease than meat eaters, in our study at least, they have a higher risk of hemorrhagic stroke. And that might be due, in fact, to their low blood cholesterol. So it could be that cholesterol good for many diseases, but low cholesterol good for many diseases, but low cholesterol might increase the risk for one type of stroke. Well, that's an area where more research is needed. But I mean, broadly, when we've looked at vegetarians, their overall health is not very different from that of meat eaters. So, you know, so it's sort of, I think the message there is meat clearly isn't essential, but it's not, you know, people who might think it's highly toxic, you know, it's not like smoking cigarettes or something like that, which is really poisonous. It's something that's got nutrients, and probably if you eat too much, it may have some bad effects.
So we might come back to vegetarians and veganism later, and I also want to talk to you about dairy, but on the note that actually people who eat a lot of meat, their health would be better if they ate less. I want to introduce Rachel Pechey, and Rachel's a behavioural scientist and really spends her whole, well, maybe not her whole life, but her working days at least, thinking hard about how we might support people to change their behaviour. Rachel, you've been thinking about this for a long time in the context of obesity, but now thinking about how do you perhaps encourage people to reduce their meat intake. Are there parallels between those two fields, or is thinking about meat completely different than thinking about sugar, for example, or eating cakes?
Yeah, so that's really the question I've been trying to answer recently, is kind of we've got this wealth of research really, we've got quite a good background of health research in the behavioural sciences, but the kind of equivalent for kind of sustainability and that kind of side of things is less well developed. So I'm kind of interested in to what extent we can take the knowledge we've got from that area and apply it to kind of sustainability. And one of the kind of, key things to think about with sustainability is meat. And obviously, as we've just been talking about, there actually are overlaps with health as well, but I've been kind of taking it from a slightly different perspective, I would say. There are several kind of ways we could think about like that they might be different. Why might meat be different from trying to target kind of healthier versus less healthy products? One of them might be social norms, for example. So kind of people think about, or previous research has suggested that meat might be kind of justified in eating because it's natural. And so, the idea that, evolutionary hominids have always eaten meat, that it's kind of normal. So I grew up eating meat.
Everybody else
my friends
eat
meat. It's just a natural part of kind of our culture, and it's quite culturally embedded. The idea that it's necessary. So I think this kind of ties in a bit with what Tim was saying, with the idea that it's really high in protein, it's got the iron, it's got the B12, and particularly the protein I think comes up quite a lot, whether or not they could replace it with other kinds of protein. And then just that it's nice. People love meat. That it's kind of, if you've grown up with it and the flavours and other stuff, it's kind of part of the diet, and kind of, as we were talking about vegans and vegetarians in that sense, like there is a word, there are meat identities. It's kind of part of, you don't have an identity for people who don't eat cake or trying to reduce salt. It's kind of a much more cultural thing in that sense.
Yeah, we have a word for people who don't eat meat.
Yeah, so it's kind of got that more identity thing there.
So maybe how much meat on average do people in the UK eat?
So I don't remember the exact figure.
Roughly.
I looked it up
Okay,
today.
well, Tim, all right, I'm going to refer to Tim.
To the rescue.
I was going to say more than they should.
Well, actually, it has come down a bit
Yes.
in the last 5 years, and it's averaging out at 56 grams a day for red and processed meat, which I was surprised. It's quite low, and it's below the recommendations of don't eat more than 70. The total meat was 99, so there's a lot of poultry there.
Okay.
Yeah.
But
So it has been coming down, but I think there's still like about a third of people who are eating above the kind of recommendation.
Well, that would probably be
But-
right. If
yeah,
the mean
so-
is
but
below
the mean
it,
is
you've
below,
still,
but there's still quite a group that are above.
So on average, intakes of, for red meat against that 70 gram look about right, but there are a third of people who are significantly above that. And of course, some people would say that recommendation, which was set quite a long time ago, is probably too high for the environment. I mean, Pete, you'd probably... your work would suggest that.
And what I was just going to say, of course, that data is from the National Diet and Nutrition Survey, which is a survey when you give people a food diary and they fill in exactly what it is that they've eaten over 3-4 days, and it's prone to under-reporting. And if you look at other statistics, the reason why that's particularly interesting, I think, is there was a recent paper came out of Susan's group, indeed, so she knows it very well, which was about looking at trends in meat consumption, which said that over the last, I think it was like 15 years, there was a fall of about 17% of meat consumption, which is kind of what you'd expect maybe over the last few years. There's been a lot of talk about veganism and vegetarianism. There's been a drive towards there, but it's not the same message that you get if you were looking at other kind of macro level measures of meat that's available for consumption in the UK, which you can get from things like food balance sheets, which the Food and Agricultural Organisation produces, which basically is just a level of the total amount of meat that is available for all of the UK participants, but population to consume. And there's loads of reasons why they might be different. There's the FAO data doesn't take into account food wastage at any point, whereas the food consumption takes into case. There might be underreporting and everything, but it's just another area, I think, where we kind of see the kind of uncertainties around here. Just even when it comes down to just literally measuring what it is that people eat is a very difficult concept to do.
Yeah, I've been in nutrition long enough to know that we still don't know what people eat.
Yeah, exactly. And with the trend of saying in the NDNS that there's less meat consumption, well, that's happening at the same time as there's more movements towards people saying, oh, well, maybe we shouldn't be eating meat quite so much. Maybe meat's bad for the environment. So you're going to have an increased trend there of people wanting to report less meat because that's going to have some social desirability of reporting less meat. So just unpicking all of those just leaves a lot of room for uncertainty.
I think that in a way touches on, and you in your introduction, Rachel, talked a little bit about how what individuals eat is to some extent a sort of social construct. But it also depends on, what turns up for lunch, for lunch today, in those glorious days when we used to eat out for lunch. Tell us a little bit. I know your work's tried to look at that intersection between individual habits and the environment. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so we've done some stuff on, for example, the availability of kind of meat or versus meat-free products, and the idea that just increasing the number of meat-free products might increase choices. Whereas they might have, something you like more there. But also this idea that, in a way, what's available kind of indicates social norms as well. Like, if you go into the supermarket and nearly all the aisle is dedicated to meat sausages, and then you've got this tiny section for meat-free sausages, what is that telling you about what others are purchasing and kind of the role of meat-free products in our society as a whole? And I think that also kind of plays in as well and creates that kind of culture and that social norm around, is this something that people do?
And what about, we've said several times that many people are trying to reduce the amount of meat they consume, either because they're concerned about the impact on the environment or perhaps to reduce their own personal risks of cancer or heart disease. Are there things we can do to help people, or once somebody's decided, do they just get on with it and, job done? Or is there a role for professionals in terms of providing additional help to people?
Yeah, so I think knowledge in itself isn't necessarily enough. So I think it's the study about like the 5-a-day campaign in the US, where it began at like 11% of people were meeting the 5-a-day recommendation, and about a similar proportion were aware of it back in the 90s. And they did this big media campaign, and after 5 years they reassessed, and between 50 and 60% were aware of it now. That's great success in getting the awareness, still stuck at 11% meeting compliance. So the knowledge in itself wasn't sufficient to kind of change the behaviour there. But there are kind of things that we could do to support things more. So, for example, there's the Optimise study that Christina Stewart's been leading on, which is kind of about self-regulation and providing kind of practical kind of ways that you could approach it. So, for example, choosing a goal, set yourself a goal each week in terms of, do you want to try one new vegetarian meal? Could you reduce the amount of meat in one of your meals that week? And just kind of thinking in a very kind of practical way about what one thing could you do. And I think in that sense, like both giving suggestions as to what you could do, but also kind of thinking about things in quite a practical steps you could make, and not, anyway, I guess, learning from the health. We don't want a crash diet in terms of, changing all your meat consumption. We want something that people can keep up and sustainably build a habit on. So becoming vegan for a week is not going to be as effective as taking out adding an extra vegetarian meal for the rest of your life. So I think there are some things like that we can learn to build on and think about practical ways we could help people to make changes. But I think we also need to think about how the environment can be structured to help them sustain those habits. So can we increase the availability of meat-free foods, or introduce labelling and things like that will help them choose which products actually have the least environmental impact? Because I think on that kind of product by product level at the minute, sorry, I've gone into environmental impact. We're talking about health today, so I've just completely deviated, so I'll draw myself back from that. But yes.
But you talk about labelling, and that makes the point, if people want to know about the health of healthiness of a product in terms of classical nutrients, there's that front of pack labelling. But at the moment, it is quite hard to know which is the most sustainable option. I mean, Pete, your team have been doing quite a bit of work to sort of think about different environmental metrics. Maybe that's a good point to hand over to you.
We have indeed,
so
yeah.
Pete is really a health modeler, well, health and environment modeler, and I guess tries to take the bird's eye view of what's going on and to look where current trends are taking us, but also what might need to happen if we're going to achieve environmentally sustainable diets and health sustainable diets too.
Yeah. So we do a variety of things in our group in terms of the modelling that we do, particularly around meat and animal-based products. But we can't do anything unless we have data. I mean, at the heart of all good models is good data. And as you say, one of the problems that we've had in terms of behaviour change, either at the individual level or even for supporting policies to make it easier for people to make behaviour changes, having that data about foods, particularly around animal-based foods and their environmental impact, because that essentially is what we think might be a motivating factor to make people change. And the reason for that is because most of the data that we have about the environmental impact of the food system is drawn from analyses that measure the environmental impact of foods that are grown on farms. So it's commodities. So it's like, what is the environmental impact of a particular type of beef production or a particular type of wheat production or what have you. But it doesn't tell you very much about what is the environmental impact of a food that you see on your supermarket shelf that has got maybe, 47 different ingredients in it, okay? It's like, it's when it gets to that point that the system just breaks down and it's like, oh, okay, well, how do we then kind of discover that? So we've got a project that's going on in our group that does a couple of things. First of all, it harvests all of the data that's available on all of the different foods, all these multi-ingredient foods that you find in your supermarket shelves, by just going around and collecting data from online supermarkets every single week on all of the products that are there. And that's built up this huge database full of foods that is genuinely really there for people to actually go and purchase and buy. But then the idea is to say, well, can we take that information and can we build algorithms that will automatically say, right, let's connect those food data up with environmental data, so that all of a sudden at this food level we can actually have data that could support something like an environmental labelling project that could roll out. And that's basically about looking at what data is available in the ingredients, linking those ingredients up with data sets about the environmental impact of foods, not just climate change, but water use, land use, water pollution, all of these different types of things. Building these algorithms that then look not only at what percentage each of these ingredients have in each food, where that data is available, but also looking at similar products, and so taking data from there and kind of linking them all up. And through doing that, we've now got this data set that will allow us to do that. So we've got a data set that's about 60,000 different foods, multi-ingredient foods, that are available in the UK marketplace that's got this environmental data connected to it. And that gives us loads of power when we go back to the health modelling, because then we can start answering questions like saying, if we started putting a labelling system in based on the environmental footprints of foods, and if we know how people will change their behaviour accordingly, then we can see how their diet would change, or we could model how their diet would change, and then we can model what the long-term health implications of that's going to be. And that brings it all together for the policymakers, so they can start looking at it in a kind of holistic way and start saying, okay, we're putting an intervention in for this particular reason, but actually we're going to look at the outcomes across a whole range of scales.
So what Tim's doing is kind of looking back at what people have eaten in the past and trying to see how that impacts on their health now. And I guess what you're trying to do is to sort of forecast into the future of scenarios. If this change was to happen, this is what we might expect. And so I guess that's the sort of data that allows us to then say, how far do we need to go to get the kind of benefits that we're looking for?
That's exactly right, although sitting on a panel with Tim is always very worrying, because as a health modeller you just take the data and you go, oh great, so we know what this relationship is with meat and health outcomes, and actually to hear about the uncertainty, to remind yourself about the uncertainty of it, is a little worrying. We do incorporate that uncertainty to some degree in the models, but there's only you can't essentially incorporate all uncertainty, particularly when you're doing future projections, because the future is unknown. A lot of our modelling projections that we've done recently completely flown out of the water because we didn't predict there would be a pandemic, a global pandemic, which kind of changes some of the answers that we get for kind of our global work. But that's exactly what it is that we're trying to do in the kind of modelling team. I should say the work that I'm going to describe is it wouldn't be possible without my colleagues Marco Springman and Mike Clark, and a team that we team up with in IFPRI in Washington DC that's led by Keith Wiebe, which is it has to be a united effort, because basically what we've been trying to do with the LEAP project is to build a modelling infrastructure which brings models of a whole loads of different elements of the food system together into one place, so that we can start asking the question, what does the food system look like in 2050? And how does it have to change in 2050 in order that we can stay within environmental boundaries? Okay, so we can set these environmental boundaries. To some degree they're artificial, to some degree they're man-made, but things like the climate change boundary of trying to stay within 1.5 degrees warming, we've kind of set that limit, set that target, and we say, okay, well, what does a food system look like that respects that target, and how does that kind of work into that area? And the whole point of that is if we can look at that and we can say, right, what does that diet look like that can produce that? Once we've produced that dietary scenario that produces that, we can then go back and link it up with the health data that's coming out of great projects like that Tim described, and we can say, right, what impact is this going to have on health, not just in the UK, but in countries around the world? So the way that we do that is we start by having to say, well, what does the diet look like? What does food consumption around the world look like right now, today? And that's from using those things, those food balance sheets that I mentioned earlier, which is a very high-level, country-level estimate of just saying, this is the type of food that is available for consumption within any particular country. Because the way they do it is they just measure all the food that's produced on the farms within that country, then they take away the food that's exported out of the country, and they add in the food that's imported, and they divide through by the total population. And they say, there you go, that's how much meat there is available for people, that's how much fruit and vegetables, etc., etc. So that gives us a broad picture about what's available for consumption around the world. And the real advantage of it is that it's used roughly the same methods for all the countries around the world. So you get the same sort of data there. But the real tricky thing is, what we're interested in is what's going to happen in 2050. So we've got to do that projection, and the first projection we've got to do to 2050 is what would happen just if nothing changes? What's our 2050 in a business as usual scenario? What's it going to look like? And to do that, you need to know loads of things. You need to know how the population is going to grow. You need to know some idea about kind of economic development around the world. You need to have some sort of scenarios around whether people are going to continue to cooperate economically, or whether there's going to be like sort of hiving off into different kind of blocks around the world. That you have to enter in different climate models, different estimates of how the climate is going to change, because that's going to affect different food production levels around the world if there's different precipitation and there's different heat in different regions. And then on top of all that, the really important thing is not just to say, well, these foods will be produced in these different ways, it's how they're going to be traded. Okay, because ultimately, if one country is producing far too much wheat for its own population, it's selling it on to other people. So that's where you need a really good agricultural economic model that says, okay, given these situations, given these different scenarios, this is what we think the trading will be between countries, and this is what we end up with.
And are you also feeding in the different sort of health parameters for different countries? Because we've talked mostly about the UK, where we're a relatively high meat-eating country. But it seems to me that if you're in a country that has very little meat and perhaps a very high prevalence of things like iron deficiency anemia, there may be positive advantages in having more.
So we do try to do that, and Tim would tell you that there's going to be very different kind of health outcomes around health associations with meat compared with the amount of consumption within the population. If you're looking at a high Western diet, a high meat consumption diet, then you're looking at it from a very different picture. In our models, what we do for our health outcomes, when we kind of model what these diets are going to be, is we look at fundamentally three things. We look at the amount of meat consumption and the health outcomes as related, as Tim has been talking about. We look at the amount of fruit and vegetables that will be in the diet, where we've got data in very similar ways around the meat that was drawn from these cohort studies. But we also look at the total amount of calories that are going to be available within the diet. And then what we can do from that is we've got estimates around the world of kind of distributions of weight within populations. And we can basically say with our models, okay, well, if calories are more available for people, then we imagine that those are going to shift up, the weight distribution, and if they're less available, they're going to shift down. And you're going to get a very different response there depending on which countries you look at. In the UK, you're going to get positive health outcomes if you're shifting that curve downwards, whereas in a lot of other countries, that's not going to be the case, and really you want to be shifting it upwards. And so we incorporate that within our models, those depending on where you start within those elements.
That's interesting. I mean, we've talked quite a bit about meat, but of course if people are not eating meat, then they're going to be eating something else in its place. And it seems to me unlikely that people go from eating a steak to eating broccoli. So is there a trade-off with fruit and veg, or do people switch to other things instead? Do people have pasta instead? Do we know that?
I kind of laugh at that because there was...
Cauliflower steaks are very popular now, so maybe people do switch.
Yeah, maybe. Tim and I did a paper a good few years ago now based on the Epic Oxford cohort, which Tim works on all the time, which has got a large number of vegans and vegetarians and meat eaters. And all we did was a simple analysis where we looked at what are the greenhouse gas emissions related to the diets of those groups. But the advantage of what we did was, for the first time, it was actually looking at real diets of vegans and real diets of vegetarians. And the reason why I laugh is because previously there was some controversy because there was the idea that actually vegan diets might end up increasing the environmental or the greenhouse gas footprint of diets, because if you replace steaks isocalorically, if with the same number of calories but with broccoli, then you end up actually increasing the carbon footprint of your meal. Yeah. And what that paper did was basically say, well, yeah, that might be the case, but nobody does that. So don't worry about it.
No, I mean, we looked in more detail and we found the vegans who don't eat any meat or dairy replace it with a whole range of foods, actually. Mm-hmm. So certainly not broccoli, but also not just tofu steaks or something. They do eat more substitutes for meat in terms of, high protein plant foods like lentils and beans and nuts, some processed sort of meat substitutes, but they also eat quite a lot more, or get quite a lot more calories from cereals and potatoes, starchy food, some more from fruit. But they don't just sort of take meat off the plate and put something else on. Okay. They eat a range of stuff, which I think is probably much more appetizing and better for their health.
So we haven't really said much about dairy. And Tim, let me just ask you again, because the health impacts of dairy, it seems to me, are much more finely balanced, because there are so many important nutrients in dairy which perhaps we don't get so easily from other sources, or am I sort of overvaluing my yoghurt?
Well, I suppose the most obvious nutrient to most people is calcium, and certainly in this country, dairy products are the biggest source of calcium. And we've found in our studies that vegans have a substantially lower intake of calcium than all the other people because they're not eating dairy. I mean, there are more... Does that
cause them a problem?
Well, we have seen a higher risk of fractures of bones, particularly hip fracture. Frustratingly, it's back to the limitations of epidemiology. We can't say for sure that the vegans are getting more fractures because they're short of calcium. We've tried to model it, adjusting for calcium or looking at the vegans who appear to be eating a lot of calcium, and that doesn't really explain what's going on. So it's possible it's not just calcium, it could be other things to do with protein and growth hormones, possibly even vitamin B12. So, it's murky at the moment. But certainly, if you look at their intake of calcium, it's worrying for a lot of the vegans. I think they do need to make sure they're getting it from somewhere else. But I think you're right, Susan, that unlike for meat, if you look at what has been done on dairy products and health, it's much more neutral and null. I think there was an assumption that dairy products would increase the risk of vascular disease because they are one of the major sources of saturated fat, certainly in this country, about the same amount as meat. But the studies that have been done have not found an increase in risk for people consuming more dairy products compared to those eating less, which is still a bit of a mystery, actually. But so that looks pretty, it looks pretty safe from that point of view. And there's quite strong evidence that dairy products may actually be protective for colorectal cancer. Okay. So the same cancer where meat has been judged to be a cause, there's a lot of evidence that more milk particularly may be protective. But I don't think anyone's been prepared to say that's definitely a fact, but the evidence points in that direction. Okay. But yeah, otherwise, there's not much to say that milk is bad. I mean, there's some evidence that milk may increase the risk of Parkinson's disease. Not, one of the top causes of death, but important. So, I think there's a lot still to be done. There's an awful lot of things we don't know about. So, at the moment, not much to say about bad things about dairy, but, I think that may change over the next few years.
Rachel, you very briefly earlier on mentioned sort of alternatives. Thinking not just of meat alternatives, but dairy alternatives. Certainly in the dairy aisle now, there are, huge ranges of plant-based milks. They're clearly gaining in popularity. Do we know who's consuming? What do we know about these sorts of products?
Going on, and I think. It's actually very interesting to hear what Tim and Pete were saying about that paper, because I think there's been a bit of a kind of unknownness about what the vegan or vegetarian who's actually engaging with this at the minute, and whether or not kind of vegan diets now look like vegan diets before. So it's interesting to see that there is some overlap between who's doing what, and I think there's definitely evidence that people are, you don't have to be vegan or vegetarian. It's kind of people across the spectrum who are engaging with the plant-based milks and the kind of meat alternatives, and this kind of rise of flexitarianism and things like that.
So the growth in these is being driven predominantly by people who also consume animal products as well, rather than entirely by people who have completely decided to take meat and dairy out of their diet.
Yeah, I think that they basically account for a larger proportion of the population still. So, each of them buying a little bit of that is still kind of going to be driving quite a lot of the sales.
Nutritionally, Tim, what do we know about these products? They're certainly much lower in calcium, although I guess some are fortified, are they?
I think, Rachel probably knows more, but I think a lot of them are fortified with calcium to about the same level as cow's milk. Okay. So I think calcium may be okay. There's questions about absorption, etc. I think the biggest difference I've noticed is protein, where most soya milk has about the same protein as cow's milk. Soya is well known to be, as a bean, very high in protein. But the others, like oat milk, are much lower in protein. And things like the almond milk that I've looked at, I think they put so few almonds effectively in the carton that although an almond is quite rich in protein, but you need to eat a few.
It's like the paint of almond.
So, I think from the nutritional perspective, I would be most concerned that if people think, if someone's drinking cow's milk and that's where they're getting their, a certain amount of protein from, and switch to one of the non-soya plant milks, their protein intake will go down quite a lot. Right. And that might have bad effects. And then there's micronutrients. I think vitamin B12 is put in a lot of these. Iodine is more variable. And iodine, it may sound a bit niche, but there's evidence that iodine intakes in this country are quite low, particularly in young women who may not be consuming much milk. And that would be a great concern if they became pregnant. And, dairy products are a major source of iodine in this country. It's probably partly because iodine is used as a disinfectant during the milking process, plus iodine is added to the cow's feed. But it seems that the plant milks in general have not all caught up with this. Some have iodine, some don't. So the evidence I've seen on vegans shows quite worryingly low levels of iodine in a lot of them. Okay. So it's complicated, basically.
What about the meat alternatives? These are springing up all over the place, of all kinds, pea protein, tofu, soy, regular vegetables. I hear all sorts of things. I mean, on the one hand, Rachel, you'll probably tell me this is an easy behavioural switch. You know, you just take the meat sausage off your plate, put the other sausage in. But I don't know how I'm going to start at that end. How do people feel about these? Do you think that these, I suppose the question for tonight is, are these a positive thing for health?
For health? Okay, so there has been quite a discussion recently based around a metric developed originally in Brazil around how you categorize foods. It's not really a metric, actually, it's a categorization of foods into different levels of processing, of which one level of processing, the highest level, is called ultra processing, which is about producing types of foodstuffs that you would only really be able to produce in an industrial factory. And they've got a very bad reputation health-wise, and there's good reason for this. If you look at most cohort studies that have looked at diets, and you categorise people by the amount of ultra-processed foods that they consume, then you can see that there's a health gradient there. The ones who are eating more ultra-processed foods tend to have worse health outcomes in some ways. I mean, you could argue that there might be lots of different confounding variables that are going on there, but that's the reason why it's kind of growing in reputation. Then you have the problem that these vegan plant-based alternatives are also put into the same camp as that. So in particular, all of the milks count as ultra-processed foods, so all of the soy milks, oat milks, etc. But also all the plant-based alternatives like sausages and burgers. And so the easy step to take is to say, well, okay, well, that's ultra-processed foods. We know ultra-processed foods are bad. So they must be bad for health-wise. Now, particularly with the milks, I'm quite concerned about that as a message that's being put out there, because particularly as Tim is saying, they're heavily fortified, these soya milks, and if you're a vegan and you're relying on these milks, we don't really want to be putting out messages to say, don't drink these plant-based milks, because they're quite often fortified with the kind of nutrients that you need within a vegan diet. And also, I don't really think that there's great evidence that's particularly, just to say all ultra-processed foods are bad seems a bit over the top in this particular endeavour. I mean, the other thing that is being characterised quite a lot is that these are new and novel foods. They're not new and novel, okay, right? They've been around for decades of these plant-based milks, plant-based burgers and sausages. And we know that the people who traditionally tend to eat a lot of them are the vegans and the vegetarians. And if you followed those diets over time, they generally have healthier outcomes. Now, that doesn't mean that absolutely everything they're eating hence must be healthier or anything like this. But to then put a kind of a sign of negative health outcomes, particularly when we also don't know about the kind of, we think there's potential issues with the type of products that they're replacing, i.e. the processed meats like the sausages and the bacon and everything, strikes me as going too far. So I would say I am concerned about messaging that goes out that says plant-based milks are unhealthy, and in terms of plant-based burgers and sausages, I would say I haven't seen all that convincing evidence beyond that's around the kind of nutritional quality of them. Quite often they're very high in salt, for example, but nothing particularly, I think, exists that says that these specifically are particularly bad for your health, beyond the fact that they're in this categorization of ultra-processed.
Mm-hmm. Rachel, in the trial that the LEAP project did, where people were encouraged to consume more of these plant-based alternatives as a strategy to reduce meat, were there any big changes in nutrient intake, or were you able to measure any changes in health outcomes?
This is the Remap trial that Filippo Bianchi did. They basically got people to swap out their meat with kind of meat-free alternatives of their choice, so soy or meat-free burgers, plant-based burgers, over like a 4-week period. And then they measured kind of what was happening at 8 weeks to see whether or not there had been any changes kind of in the 4 weeks since the swap was over, as it were. And they found that there had been a kind of weight loss, but there was no differences in terms of the kind of macronutrients, so the saturated fat or the salt or the kind of sugar content of the diets. I don't think there was anything on micronutrients, so I don't know whether there's anything in the processing or whatever that would be there. But I think the kind of Pete's right that baseline is important. Like, what are they switching between? Like, if you're switching the meat, kind of alternatives of processed meat to that kind of meat-free, then it kind of seems to me like that's probably, you know, well, it's hard to say at this point, but, you know, chances are it's kind of doing no harm, but, you know, it may not be that beneficial.
I guess also they're still a relatively small proportion of the overall diet. You know, you know, they're not accounting for the bulk of our calories and so on. I mean, Tim, what you've been studying vegetarians and vegans for a long time. You must have seen that the nature of what they're eating has changed. And do you think that's going to have implications for the healthiness of vegetarian and vegan diets going forward?
Well, obviously it could do, yes. I mean, I think sort of following up particularly on what Pete was saying, to me, although this ultra-processed classification is one way of describing what's happening and it is interesting, I find it more helpful to focus on the nutrients where we really know there's an effect on health. So if people are eating more of processed vegan foods that have had lots of added saturated fat and salt and in some cases sugar, then obviously you would predict that would be bad, and it might be worse than the sausage if there's more saturated fat and salt. And I think that's, for me, that's what we should be focusing on, you know, analysing specific things. There's a fairly short list of nutrients where we're confident that they have, that there are sort of, you know, at the levels, you know, in this country that there are people eating too much, and too much is going to have bad effects on health. So I think, you know, saturated fat, salt and sugar are the main ones. And then sort of looking at the other way, what about micronutrient deficiencies? Well, you know, if vegans are eating synthetic meats that don't have any vitamin B12 added, and they're not getting it from anyone else, they will get deficient. So, you know, I think these are the things that it should be reduced to. But it is interesting, if you look back to when we started doing this work, things like plant milk were designed very much by people who were trying to produce something healthy. And they were sort of looking at what's in cow's milk and making sure it had all the things that you needed, like protein and calcium and iodine. And then they were not putting oil in that was saturated fat. They were putting in what's thought to be healthy oil. And that is such an obvious way to do it. And I think the older plant meats were a bit like that. It was soya mince, and it was usually fortified with vitamin B12 and maybe with iron as well. So it was sort of like meat, had the same nutrients that people tend to rely on meat for, protein, B12 and iron, but at the same time it didn't have the saturated fat and a lot of salt, which, you know, are a bad thing. You know, so it's frustrating really if there's a lot of stuff coming in the market and it's what's behind it is just can you sell it to people and they will eat it and you can make a lot of money, rather than some sort of thinking on health.
Trying to optimise the sort of...
Yeah, it's an opportunity really
Yeah.
to improve people's health, and it's depressing if that is not followed through and people end up eating more salt than they used to.
Pete?
Yeah, the other thing to say around plant-based alternatives, I think, is it's very important kind of almost what your comparison is, what your counterfactual is, because I think quite a lot of the criticism that they're getting at the moment, because particularly I think what's starting now is a lot of people are criticising them for their environmental credentials. They're saying, okay, well actually, environmentally these aren't great because ultra-processed foods are, obviously they've got an environmental footprint because there must be an environmental measure in impact in terms of actually doing the processing. If you compare them to the meat alternatives or the dairy alternatives that they're replacing, they're just nowhere near. It's just not even close. But if you're taking your counterfactual as an ideal diet of like sort of whole foods of fruit and vegetables and everything cooked from scratch and no kind of processed foods, then you can see where that narrative builds up, because then it fits into that area of saying, oh, well, that's not the same as this perfect diet. And to me, to some degree, it's kind of analogous to almost like your soft drink debate, where in the UK we've got a tax on soft drinks that's based on the sugar levels. And essentially it was designed to try and push people towards diet soft drinks. It was designed to try and push manufacturers to remove sugar from soft drinks and replace it with sweeteners. Now, diet soft drinks and sugared soft drinks, they both fall into this ultra-processed category, yeah, right? And I think health campaigners would look at diet soft drinks and say, well, they're not perfect, we should all be drinking water, really. But also they'd probably pragmatically say, but it's better for people to be drinking diet soft drinks than to be drinking full sugar soft drinks. And I think plant-based alternatives surely fall in a similar sort of place where surely it's better for people to be, for at least for the environment, and I know this is mainly about health, at least for the environment, it's absolutely clear that people will be better off having plant-based alternatives.
But I think what Tim is saying is that many of the milks can be because they have been fortified, and so there are attempts to make them as healthy.
Yeah, no, well, I would agree with that. I mean, that's where my actual concern is as well, because I think there's a risk here, because these are products where they are being fortified, particularly the milks, with vital nutrients which are in low command in vegan diets. And actually, if people are being scared away from them from messages around saying, like, well, these are unhealthy or bad for the environment, I think that could potentially be a negative thing.
So, I mean, I just want to say, I want to definitely add to that I think that perhaps to begin with, they were had this kind of health halo where they were being presented as almost, these great health plant-based things, and this is sort of a backlash to that. But neither do they have a health halo particularly, but neither should they be demonized. They're just foods.
It's the backlash being pushed by the relevant farming industry.
I think we've seen, I mean, so I think it's going hand in hand, isn't it, with the movement towards, you can't obviously call soya milks anymore. They're on, if you look at them in the supermarkets, they're now called soya drink or an oat drink. Like that name has been removed because you can't do it in the similar way. And I think it's the similar sort of ideas around saying, okay, well, these are unnatural products and we can't be using the same terminology, so we won't use it. I think there probably is a similar sort of alliance that is moving in that direction. However, having said that, it's definitely not entirely driven by that, because I've seen a lot of people in the public health community that are certainly very concerned about ultra-processed foods and plant-based alternatives in particular.
We're in the position that we're trying to change diets to reduce the environmental impact of our diet. And in order to do that without compromising health, actually, there has to be a bit more sort of tech, a bit more thought of whether that's fortification or novel ways of processing in order to reap the environmental benefits whilst also producing something that's acceptable. But does that mean that we have to look towards a tech future? And if so, how do you feel about the idea of lab-grown meat? I mean, on the health front, is that going to be just as harmful as meat is?
Well, I think if it had the same amount of saturated fat,
right,
and if processed the same amount of salt, you would think it would have the same effect on health.
But I guess we have to wait for that
to you could probably,
yeah.
it seems quite likely you could grow it low in fat and high in heme iron, and so maybe it could be better than the average sort of natural meat.
One thing I've never got to the bottom of in terms of the lab-grown meat is whether we're ever going to get to the point of lab-grown meat that can replace like whole meat products that like a roast beef or a roast chicken. Or it seems to be lab-grown meat is based around burgers and nuggets and things, which you would then imagine is going to fit, especially with the type of foods that go with it, into a less healthy diet. But I don't know. Maybe I'm just not up to date with the latest tech.
I need to thank you for that, because that's a great segue into one of the other sessions that are also part of this series, where we'll be talking to people behind some of these lab-grown meat companies to hear their views on how the technology is developing and what they're thinking of in terms of growing that market.
I'll have to watch it then.
We could all talk about this all evening, but I'm actually going to open this up to questions from our audience who've been listening to us online. And by the wonders of technology, I'm going to find a few questions which I'm going to put to you from people who've been watching today. So, here's one. Tim trained as a vet originally, so here's one taking you back to your roots. What about zoonotic diseases that can lead to what's the impact in health what about E. coli, salmonella, influenza and other zoonotic diseases that can lead to the pandemic because of farming and meat consumption? That's a tricky one.
Well,
Do you want to?
I don't think, sadly, I don't have a proper answer,
Right.
but it's really a good question. Potentially, there are huge impacts of meat, including obviously on COVID.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just not something I've worked on, and I don't think I can give you any sort of serious answers. But I think it's probably something there should be more work on, because it is a big, food poisoning, just simple stuff, is a big problem.
So it's one of the areas that is underlooked at, I think, in the health modelling areas as well, and it's one of the areas that we want to do some more work in, because at the moment the way with the health modelling work that we'd look at kind of global trends in food production and then food consumption and their health outcomes, they're all based around kind of like sort of a kind of traditional kind of method of here's the farm, produces the food, goes off to the supermarket, and it's also, if you look at the way that we kind of do the methods, it's all down the line, kind of just looking at, well, what's the mean idea, what's the average idea kind of going forward. And actually some of these like zoonotic disease outbursts and everything like that, you can almost look at them as equivalent as extreme events in climate change, which again, we don't really model very well at the moment. So rather than just saying, okay, well, temperature's going to keep increasing to this level and that'll be the average temperature to produce the crops. Well, actually, what's really going to happen is if temperature keeps increasing, you're going to have a lot more years when whole crops are just wiped out, and that needs to be brought into the modelling better. And if we can also be looking at bringing into those elements around, if we've got this kind of close, the way that the farming is produced, close livelihood between humans and animals, then that's going to prompt zoonotic diseases as well. That's other things that could potentially be modelled. As with the one which is not mentioned there, which again would be really important, would be antimicrobial resistance as well, for similar sort of reasons, because so much antibiotics are used in keeping animals healthy in highly industrialised farm systems.
Rachel, here's one for you. Schools have an important part to play. School meals, we talk a lot about bringing children up with and introducing them into healthy diets. What do you think schools could be doing to promote more plant-based meals? Are there, again, you said education only takes you so far. So are there sort of nudges we could be doing in the school canteen?
Yeah, potentially there's quite a lot of different things. I mean, I think one really obvious one is just exposure. We know that mere exposure to food in itself kind of creates liking. So if you show people pretty much anything, like characters from a different language or whatever else, and you show them again, they like ones they've seen before more, and it kind of goes across to food as well. So So if you give kids like portions of fruit and veg to try in school, the kind of fruit and veg consumption in schools will go up. So carrying that across, you would imagine that if you increase the vegetarian foods in schools and kind of normalise that and get kids exposed to those foods and just increasing their liking of it, because it takes often quite a long time to get kids used to. I can attest for my 2-year-old that we're still working on that. But more and more exposure is kind of quite a key component, I think. And there could be other things too. There might be kind of ways of getting kind of a social norm, or other kids in your class are choosing this too, and other things like that you could do to get a kind of more of a kind of nudge style.
Is it about building a bit of excitement into these foods, that they're the sort of more interesting dishes, or maybe?
Yeah, there've definitely been some work on kind of creative naming for dishes, or kind of associated like superhero characters and things like that will help encourage kids to kind of try different foods. And I think, it's not just, giving the kids the food, it's encouraging them to get motivated enough to try a novel food as well. So that kind of thing can also help just get over that barrier, that potential neophobia for children, and build up that hopefully, that liking.
Thank you. And then Pete, one for you. So somebody is very interested in your database of all these products and wants to know how they could work out whether the meals that they were cooking at home, how they stack up in terms of their environmental rating or their health impacts compared to processed supermarket foods. Have you got to that point yet where there's a do-it-yourself calculator?
Not quite. You had me worried there because I thought it was like someone from Tesco's, right? So, don't be collecting that. So no, it's potentially the process that we have for basically splitting up and saying, okay, so this is the environmental impact for each of these processed foods, could work on menus in a similar way. It would actually work much, much better on menus because the beautiful, recipes is what I mean. The beautiful thing about recipes is it actually tells you how much of each of the ingredients needs to be in there, so we don't have to make a guess about that. So yes, that could certainly be the case. We have had a look at doing something on online recipes where it basically you can go, there's all these obviously online recipe databases and go through that and say, okay, well here's all these ingredients, can we match them up and kind of put them together, and haven't yet produced anything with those results that are getting there. It's a potential idea as a little intervention potentially to help people achieve more healthier goals. One thing we are doing with it, because more what we're interested in our research group is kind of population level changes, so the kind of nudges that Rachel's been talking about to make food more environmentally sustainable or more healthy, is we've been producing, and I keep saying we tonight, other people have been using the data to produce a tool for canteen managers to be able to say, okay, well, if as this organisation we've made a commitment to try and reduce the greenhouse gas emissions related with what we're selling, then actually they've got a tool there to say, right, we can track exactly what it is that we're selling and kind of start moving down and changing the options that are available to try and make it more healthy. So we're working on that level, and it's basically the same sort of idea again. You've got different foods and it just calculates the footprint.
Good, and Tim, I think a final one for you, which I'm feeling bad about because I should have raised this earlier. What about fish? Is fish, in health terms, would we be better off switching from meat to fish or from meat to vegetables? You
mean, is fish better than
vegetables? Tell me about fish and health.
Well, fish,
I suppose that's the question.
Well, I suppose if you start from what we do expect, then fish are not high in saturated fats. So on that point, they should score better than meat. There's also been huge interest in whether the particular types of oil in some types of fish may be beneficial, mostly in relation to heart disease. The data we have is sort of consistent with the idea that fish are associated with a lower risk of ischemic heart disease, certainly compared with eating meat. So they appear to be a better choice. And there's also some evidence for colorectal cancer, funnily enough the same cancer where meat is bad and dairy seems to be good, some evidence that fish may reduce the risk. For most diseases, there's little evidence that I'm aware of on whether fish is good or bad. But, I mean, probably realistically, most people are not talking about eating fish every day. So, eating some fish rather than meat, most people would think would be better for your health. I mean, in our cohort study in Oxford, we've got, 20,000 people who never eat any fish. And their health seems to be pretty similar to that of people who do eat fish. So at a sort of gross level, it's not clear that you're better off eating fish than eating vegetarian foods.
Seems to me there's quite, there's just quite a lot of flexibility in our diets. You can have a reasonably healthy diet in many different ways.
I think if you get get the nutrients that you need, and you don't get excess stuff that you don't want that's bad, then probably lots of ways of getting that should be compatible with good health.
And I guess that, we can see that when we look around the world, when people have incredibly different diets, but obviously some big health disparities, but actually in other cases,
well, they can have successful societies over millennia on very different diets. They may suffer different diseases, so it's not to say there's no problem, but they're compatible with a sort of a civilization that is people are happy.
Gosh, I mean, this is just a fascinating conversation. It also goes to show how hard it is just to talk about health. And that's fair enough, really, because at the end of the day, we need a food system that is good enough for health, but is also good enough for our planet, too. And we've got to find ways bringing these two different dimensions together. I think we heard earlier, well, at the start, that actually meat intakes possibly are declining a little bit in the UK. And we would generally think that that's going to be a good thing for health and for the environment. But I think what Tim has taught us with the degree of uncertainty is that we can't be absolutely confident in what the health impacts will be without knowing more about the sorts of diets that people are going to adopt, and whether the sort of new flexitarian type approach, to coin Rachel's phrase, is going to be the same as the old vegetarianism. It really remains to be seen, because they might be quite different diets. Well, as academics, we always love it when there's plenty of questions left to answer. But I hope too that this work is sufficient to actually begin to give some of the evidence, both to individuals who are trying to live healthier, more sustainable lives, but also to policymakers, especially, of course, with COP26 on the horizon. Thank you very much to Professor Tim Key, Dr. Rachel Pechey and Professor Pete Scarborough for joining me tonight. Great as ever to talk to you all. And thank you to everybody who's been watching this evening, and I hope you've enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.